Sorry, Robin, I'll start again. First question, how is the expression selling the family silver been used yet in Windhoek?
Oh yes, very much so. And I think this meeting was interesting for a number of reasons. One is that it was a central bank that organised the meeting, and although there's no official debate on privatisation in Namibia, and certainly the ruling party's manifesto doesn't make any mention of privatisation, clearly the central bank decided now was the time to start the ball rolling again on this quite problematic issue. So of course the minister turned up, and that was the second thing about the symposium. He stayed all the way through, which is quite unusual, and made quite a contribution to the debate. I think that's a very healthy sign. But he made it very clear that the Namibian government would need very good reasons if it was to go ahead and privatise the family silver, if you like.
And as you probably know, in this country, there's a big debate at the moment whether or not private assets should be taken over by the state. It's ironic that you're almost going to the opposite there in Windhoek.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there has also been a bit of a debate in Namibia about the state nationalising mines, for example. But I think overall the feeling is, look, our state-owned enterprises aren't doing too badly, but there's certainly a need to inject private skills and private money into a lot of their operations. And the question is really, how do we go about doing that? I think one of the key issues is that this country faces the need for massive investment in infrastructure of all sorts over the coming 5 to 10 years. The key question is, where is that money going to come from? Does government have the money to put into it? Not really. Does the private sector have the money to put into it? Well, actually it does, but only under certain conditions. And I think that's where the privatisation debate really needs to head in this country.
But to quote the minister, I mean, also he said that he thinks that private companies are going to cherry pick the best business, then leave the state struggling to deal with the rest of the people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the point he made is an interesting one. It's one I've heard him make many times before, but I don't think it's entirely accurate. His view was the private investors are only really interested in those state-owned enterprises that are already making money, and that they're not interested in the ones that are struggling. I disagree with the minister there. I think there are several examples, for example, Namibia wildlife resorts, where the private investors would love to get their hands on and do something good with. Government hasn't allowed them to do that. Even our struggling national airline, Air Namibia, is a potential privatisation candidate. The trouble is, if government puts too many conditions on that privatisation, then of course private investors are not going to touch it, because their hands are basically tied in terms of how they can make money through this business. So I think there is some evidence that the minister's right, but I think by and large, I think even he would concede, probably in private, that there is a desperate need for private money and skills in our state-owned enterprise sector.
But having said that, though, I mean, Geingob, I mean, he's got a very deep roots in the struggle. He's a political heavyweight in Namibia. Surely, if he's against it, particularly publicly, it's got no chance, really, of flying.
I actually mentioned to him at the meeting last week that I quoted him from the 1999 budget speech, where our then Minister of Finance, Nangola Mbumba, had held out the olive branch that, yes, government was thinking of privatising telecom and Nampower. Nothing's happened in the intervening 10 years. I think by and large, although heavyweights like Geingob have significant struggle credentials and have played their part in freeing this country and all the rest of it, I think the Namibian approach to policy making is very pragmatic. And I think we've already seen private investors come in the telecom sector, for example. We've seen Namibian state-owned enterprises working very constructively with private investors, Namport, even Nampower, the electricity company, through IPPs. So I think there's a very pragmatic approach to this whole issue. And I think that's probably a good thing. We have to de-ideologicalise this whole debate and look at what really works for the country as a whole.
So bearing in mind all that we've just said, how likely is it that we're going to see a flurry of public offerings and publicly owned companies being sold off?
Yeah, okay. Well, one of the speakers at last week's meeting was a Korean, Professor Jin Park, who offered the advice that if you are going to go to privatise companies, you need A, political commitment, and B, you need to start immediately after the president gets a mandate to do it. Now, we're on the verge of elections, the end of November. I see no sign of privatisation on the horizon at all, so I suspect we're going to have to wait possibly another 5 years before anything really significant happens. However, as I said, given the pragmatic approach to policy making in this country, I think we could see movement, but in a sort of under the radar screen kind of way, where we get more private investment in these infrastructure projects and things without a wholesale big bang national privatisation programme.
And lastly, and very briefly, Robin, as an independent economist, what would be your top picks for privatisation if you had to give the top three?
Top three, interesting. Well, I would certainly privatise Telecom Namibia. That's our fixed line operator here. I think our telecom sector has already undergone significant change. We've brought private sector players in, and now there's a good case for cutting all three loose from the public sector and letting them compete on a level playing field with service-neutral licenses. So that would be my first candidate. I think telecoms is desperately crying out for more investment, more private money and skills. Secondly, I would privatise Namibia wildlife resorts. I don't think government has any business or any skills running tourism resorts. I think that's very outdated thinking. And I think there are lots of imaginative ways we can get private investors in without destroying local communities or destroying national parks or all these sorts of things. And then perhaps finally, I would look at Air Namibia, take a long, hard look at it again and say, look, maybe we have to drop some of the intercontinental routes, or we have to get into bed with a significant international player where we brand particular planes in a Namibian way, but basically we take out the sort of year-on-year hundreds of millions of dollars of losses. So we have to think imaginatively there. I think those three would be my candidates.